Hello, I'm Bud Dar. I'm the Executive Vice President for Maritime Policy and Government Affairs at the MSC Group based in Geneva, Switzerland. I work across all of our business areas, including ocean cargo shipping, cruise shipping, ro-ro ferries, ro-pax ferries, high-speed ferries, and intermodal businesses such as railways and terminals and trucks that accompany the transportation of ocean goods, which is our core business. I'm very pleased to speak with you today about the topic of decarbonization. And although my portfolio of work is very broad, there's no question that this is the most important challenge that we face as a company. It is also the biggest challenge that we face as a company, and I would venture to say the biggest and most important challenge that the entire maritime sector has ever faced. Some look back at the fuel changes in 2020 that came about, and I don't think it was an exaggeration to say that that was the single biggest change in maritime regulation in the history of maritime regulation. It all theoretically happened on one date. It's just the tip of the iceberg compared to what we're dealing with overall with decarbonization. It's a much more complex topic, and it has fewer solutions readily available, and a lot of work yet to be done on a very lengthy timeline that will carry on both in its activity and its results far beyond the working age of people such as myself, and it will really make a difference for future generations whether we succeed or fail. And about that, I want to say, we're not going to be judged on the aspirational statements that we make. We're not going to be judged on the best sound bites. We're going to be judged on our actual results towards decarbonization. I think it's important to keep that in mind rather than to fixate on arbitrary, specific details, but rather keep the big picture in mind that we must decarbonize as soon as we can do it. And our industry, our company, MSC, is working as hard as we can on that every single day. And I devote a huge amount of my time on it and my teams as well. So what do we focus on? Really, I look at three central pillars around decarbonization to kind of guide me. And one is to be creative. The second is to be collaborative. And the third is to be optimistic. Let me start with the first one about being creative. What do I mean by that? I mean that, in my opinion, and in the view of our company, it really is not helpful to fixate on one single silver bullet solution out there because I don't think it exists. If you look at the diversity of our fleet, the various ship types and various deployments that we have, and we have roughly 700 or so vessels of various types and shapes and sizes across the MSC group, we're a pretty good microcosm of the whole industry. And I can't really see, at least any time in the foreseeable future, having just one single decarbonization solution fit that. We instead need a range of solutions, and we're very much of an open mind about a variety of molecules that can help us get there. Which ones in particular are we talking about? Well, in hand right now, to some degree, you have a limited supply of biofuels in a conventional liquid form. We used 850,000 metric tons of biofuel in our fleet in 2020, up to a 47% blend. But it's in limited supply, and the cost dynamics of that are really challenging until you get to the point that there's government support for it in the form of regulation or subsidies, or the customers are willing to pay for it in greater numbers than we've seen to date. Also, you can make a transition to LNG. We're doing that today, where fossil-based LNG gets you a modest improvement of roughly, I think, in the range of 8 to 23% CO2 equivalent reduction and on a well-to-wake basis. Not enough to get us to decarbonization, but it's a good start, and it's progress we can make today if we can manage properly methane emissions throughout the entire life cycle, which is very important, and it has to be tackled. But I do believe that's a solvable problem. But the key is migrating off of the fossil-based forms of that we have today and onto a synthetic bioform in the future, which actually can really have the decarbonization longer-term solution associated with it. And then the third thing you have more imminently than some other fuels is I think we'll see the emergence of green methanol fairly soon. So in those short-term possibilities, we're preparing for all those, and we're making investments in what it takes to be ready to use all of those. But at the end of the day, it's the fuel that's needed critically to make all this happen. Without the fuels being produced, supplied, and delivered to us at a reasonable price where we can afford and the market can afford to pay for it, we won't get to decarbonization. That's ultimately going to be an essential piece to this, and it's not something that shipping companies themselves do. So we work in partnerships, and more on that in a moment. So in the longer term solutions, when it comes to green hydrogen, it has a role, although it'll probably be limited as a direct fuel in our case, but in some applications it maybe can be more effective as a direct fuel. But it can be an excellent feedstock towards things like green ammonia, e-methanol, or e-LNG, which come on the horizon. You don't really get there without that green hydrogen stock and all it takes to get that. So when I say creative, we haven't ruled out any of the options for the actual molecules. We have ruled out some production sources and methods because we don't think that they really get the net benefit for the environment that's required. And I also wouldn't rule out the possibility that maybe we could see the nuclear fueled ships at some point in the future too. There's some promising technology that is at least worth a look there. So that's what I mean by being creative. When I talk about being collaborative, it's not only in the sense of technical collaboration, because that is required, and we're doing that. We have a formal partnership with Shell, major energy provider for us, as well as the world, and also other collaborations with manufacturers of various equipment types and also various energy sources. And we're developing more and more every day because we can't do this alone. Even a company our size can't do this alone as a company. I don't believe the shipping sector can do it alone. We really need collaboration beyond our sector and outside, looking at other sectors, not just those people that we are familiar with or those stakeholders we're familiar with in our normal environment. So we're working on that every day and exploring those options and trying to find new solutions through that collaboration and cultivate and send the demand signals that are necessary to bring the new technology and the new fuels to the market with the speed that we need. Also, when it comes to collaboration, we need to work with government stakeholders as well. We don't need them to do everything for us. We'll buy ships, we'll operate ships, we'll send the demand signal, we'll build partnerships, but there really is a role for government to play, and not only stimulating research and development to make sure that the ships of not so far downrange into tomorrow, but very soon, are capable of receiving and using these fuels, but also to stimulate the market as well for the production and delivery of the fuels. Because without that, it's just not going to work, as I mentioned. So they really need to work on that upstream component and encourage bringing to the marketplace at large scale these fuels and making sure that shipping gets their fair share of it. The last element of collaboration that I'll mention is a really important one, and that is this is a very expensive energy transition. There will be many expensive energy transitions throughout society, but I'm most familiar with the one for shipping. Just as I expect that I'm going to have to pay more money to fuel my automobile, whether it's electric or otherwise, I'm going to have to pay more money to heat my home. We're going to have to pay more money to keep the global shipping network functioning. And it's important that we have a proper perspective on that. Those costs, which are measured in trillions, not billions of dollars most accurately, need to be borne throughout the supply chain. And at the end of the day, these just simply can't be absorbed by the ship owners on our own. It's not going to work that way, because we have to be able to get a reasonable profit of some amount to be able to stay in business, to provide the service that's needed to be the global conduit for trade that we are. So I think it's important to understand that our customers, and ultimately the customers of our customers at the consumer level, are going to need to be prepared to shoulder their fair share of the cost for this transition, because it's just the reality that until we reach a point where these types of fuels and energy sources become normalized in our day-to-day lives and usage throughout society, it's going to have some exceptional costs associated with it. And estimates range from, say, 2 to 8 times the cost of fuels as we know them today. So it is significant, but I think it's manageable, and I really think that we can do that. And that leads me to the last point about being optimistic. I think it's very important that we be optimistic. We can do this. We have to believe that, and I do believe it, and I'm working with it every day with people that believe it. It's just a question of how fast can we do it, Can we bring it together properly, bring it together collaboratively in light of the two earlier principles I mentioned of being creative and being collaborative? And one of the elements that keeps me optimistic is that it is possible to have a global carbon pricing regime and global market-based measure that could apply to all of shipping to help normalize the costs that the market will be slow to bring into balance for these new fuels, which will almost without exception be more expensive, as I mentioned, than the fuels we have today. That can really happen if governments will put aside their geopolitical differences over that principle and help us, as the industry has called for. And my company, among others, have been very vocal about the need for governments to establish carbon pricing and a global market-based measure. That will help a lot. We really need that to stimulate the development and delivery of these fuels to where we need them and make them mainstream fuels that we're using all the time and comfortable with. Also, there's a proposal from the industry to establish an international maritime research fund, which would be funded by the industry. We're happy to pay for it. That's our proposal. And it could be capitalized at $10 billion or more through contributions from ship owners, but we need the regulatory structure to do that. We need governments to work with us to help establish that structure so that we can make sure that the technology side of this is ready to meet the fuel supply side of it when that side gets stimulated sufficiently to bring the fuels to us that we need, and then we can consume and be ready for it. So in our company, what are we doing? We're today building out supply chain possibilities with the energy providers. We are looking at our new designs to make sure that we are taking delivery of ships, that we have a vision for how we can adapt them later to future fuels if have to operate today, which is in a different world, which is a world where we don't really have the future fuels. And it is possible to do that technologically. The engine manufacturers and others are really getting close to solutions that allow us to be more adaptable. There's extra cost involved, but it's worth it because we really do need to be able to adapt our fleets later as the fuel situation changes. We can't predict exactly what the most prominent fuel is going to be in the marketplace, and it may be different from place to place, and it may be different as far as desirability to suit the needs for different types of ships and different types of services. But we're doing our very best to be ready. We're also looking at our existing fleet. And with the existing fleet, we're looking at ways that we can adapt as well those ships to accommodate future fuels throughout their life cycle. And then one other point that I want to make about both future and existing ships for us is that we always valued energy efficiency. And it's one of those areas that makes good economic sense from a business perspective. And it also serves a very valuable environmental need because less energy consumption on board means less energy production, means less greenhouse gas production. So that is all really valuable synergy that we should embrace, and we always have. But I believe energy efficiency is going to be even more important for the future than it is today, because what it will do is not only will it help equalize this cost differential between the new fuels and the existing fuels, but it will also help minimize the amount of fuel that has to be carried on board any particular ship. And that's important because almost all of these future fuels we're looking at have energy density challenges with them. And particularly for large, long-range ocean-going ships, that's extremely important because it's a big challenge to overcome. We have to carry all of our fuel around with us. The less of it we have to carry, the more options we have available sooner rather than later. So a couple of quick things. One is our company's committed to net zero for 2050. And that's without external offsetting. We think that's important, and you hear the whole industry now calling for that, and in some cases even more aggressive goals. Whether or not 2050 or 2045 or 2040 is the right date, I don't know. Nobody really knows for sure. But it's a much more sensible, practical target to help meet the society's expectations of where we will get against the backdrop of the Paris Accord and what's really needed to combat climate change than previous targets that were set. And we think that's an appropriate one. We support carbon pricing and a market-based measure, as I said, and we also support establishment of an international research fund to help promote other types of collaboration in addition to those that are taking place naturally. Lastly, I'll just repeat what I believe in and what I urge everyone to believe in is be creative, be collaborative, and be optimistic. And working together and following those principles, we will get there, we will achieve success, and we must succeed, but we will succeed only together.